Hello!
And welcome to Larry's Library.
Hello, welcome to Larry's Library. Let me see if I can change the lighting in here. Something looks different.
Very blue.
Yes.
Maybe that might help a little bit. Oh. Well, tonight we'll be reading chapters 22 and 23. And so it's going to be about 20 minutes total, so we'll get started with chapter 22. Yeah, there's a baby raccoon after we finish reading. We're going to go feed it, I think. Chapter 22, Excursion into Unknown Tracts. My first thought the next morning was to fetch the sledge from the wood. I had a double motive for leaving it there, which I had refrained from explaining to my wife to avoid giving her uneasiness. I had formed a wish to penetrate a little farther into the land and ascertain whether anything useful would present itself beyond the wall of rocks. I was, besides, desirous to be better acquainted with the extent, the form, and general productions of our island. I wished Fritz only, who was stronger and more courageous than his brothers, and Turk, to accompany me. We set out very early in the morning and drove the ass before us for the purpose of drawing home the sledge. As we were picking up some acorns, different birds of exquisite plumage flitted about us. For this once I could not refuse Fritz the pleasure of firing upon them, that we might learn their species. He brought down 3. I recognized one to be the great blue Virginia jay, and the other 2 were parrots. One of the 2 was a superb red parrot, the other was green and yellow. We soon arrived at the guava trees, and a little after at the spot where we had left the sledge, when we found our treasures in the best possible condition. But as the morning was not far advanced, we entered upon our intended project of penetrating beyond the wall of rocks. We pursued our way in a straight line at the foot of these massy, solid productions of nature, every moment expecting to reach their extremity or to find some turn or breach or passage through them that should conduct us into the interior of the island, if, as I presumed, it was not terminated by these rocks. We walked on, continually looking about that nothing might escape us worthy of notice, and to anticipate and avoid such dangers as should threaten. We next entered a pretty little grove, the trees of which were unknown to us. Their branches were loaded with large quantities of berries of an extraordinary quality, being entirely covered with a minute meal or farina. I knew of a sort of bush, the berries of which, when boiled, yield a viscous scum resembling wax. It grows in America and is named by botanists Myrica cerifera, or candleberry tree. This plant resembled it much, and the discovery gave me great pleasure. A short time after, another object presented itself with equal claims to our attention. It was the singular modes of behavior of a kind of bird scarcely larger than a chaffinch, and clothed in feathers of a common brown color. These birds appeared to exist as a republic, there being among them one common nest, inhabited at pleasure by all their tribes. We saw one of these nests in a tree in a somewhat retired situation. It was formed of plaited straws and bulrushes intermixed. It enclosed great numbers of inhabitants, and was built round the trunk of a tree. It had a kind of roof formed of roots and bulrushes, carefully knit together. We observed in the sides small apertures, seemingly intended as doors and windows to each particular cell of this general receptacle. From a few of these apertures issued some small branches, which served the birds as points of rest for entering and returning. The external appearance of the whole excited the image of an immensely large sponge. While we were attentively examining this interesting little colony, we perceived numbers of a very small kind of parrot hovering about the nest. Their gilded green wings and the variety of their colors produced a beautiful effect. They seemed to be perpetually disputing with the colonists, and not infrequently endeavored to prevent their entrance into the building. They attacked them fiercely, and even tried to peck at us if we but advanced our hands to the structure. Fritz, who was well trained in the art of climbing trees, was earnestly desirous to take a nearer view of them, and to secure, if possible, a few individuals. He threw his burden down and climbed to the nest. He then tried to introduce his hand into one of the apertures, and to seize whatever living creature it should touch in that particular cell. What he most desired was to find a female brooding, and to carry both her and her eggs away. Several of the cells were empty, but by perseverance he found one in the situation he wished. But he received so violent a peck from an invisible bird that his only care was now to withdraw his hand. Presently, however, he ventured a second time to pass his hand into the nest, and succeeded in seizing his prey, which he laid hold of, and in spite of the bird's resistance, he drew it through the aperture and squeezed it into the pocket of his waistcoat, and buttoning it securely, he slided down the tree and reached the ground in safety. The signals of distress sent forth by the prisoner collected a multitude of birds from their cells, who all surrounded him, uttering loud cries and attacking him with their beaks till he had made good his retreat. He now released the prisoner, and we discovered him to be a beautiful green parrot, which Fritz entreated he might be allowed to preserve and to make a present of to his brothers, who would make a cage to keep him in, and would then tame him and teach him to speak. On the road home, we observed to each other that from the circumstance of this young bird's nesting within the structure, it appeared probable that the true right of property was in this species, and that the brown-colored birds we at first observed were intruders endeavoring to deprive them of it. We reached a wood, the trees of which in a small degree resembled the wild fig tree, at least the fruit they bore, like the fig, was round in form, and contained a soft, juicy substance full of small grains. Their height was from 40 to 60 feet, the bark of the trunk was scaly like the pineapple, and wholly bare of branches except at the very top. The leaves of these trees are very thick, in substance tough like leather, and their upper and under surfaces are different in color. But what surprised us the most was a kind of gum which issued in a liquid state from the trunk of the tree, and became immediately hardened by the air. This discovery awakened Fritz's attention. In Europe he had often made use of the gum produced by cherry trees, either as a cement or varnish, in his youthful occupations, and the thought struck him that he could do the same with what he now saw. As he walked, he frequently looked at his gum, which he tried to soften with his breath, but without success. He now discovered a still more singular property in the substance, that of stretching on being pulled at the extremities, and on being let go, of reducing itself instantly by the power of an elastic principle. He was struck with surprise and sprang towards me, repeating the experiment before my eyes and exclaiming, "Look, father, if this is not the very thing we formerly used to rub out bad strokes in our drawings." "Ah, what do you tell me?" cried I with joy. "Such a discovery would be valuable indeed. The best thanks of all will be due to you if it is the true caoutchouc tree which yields the Indian rubber. Quick, hand it here that I may examine it." Having satisfied myself of our good fortune, I had now to explain that caoutchouc is a kind of milky sap which runs from its tree in consequence of incisions made in the bark. This liquid is received in vessels placed expressly for the purpose. It is afterwards made to take the form of dark-colored bottles of different sizes, such as we have seen them in the following manner, bless you. Before the liquid has time to coagulate, some small earthen bottles are dipped into it a sufficient number of times to form the thickness required. These vessels are then hung over smoke, which completely dries them and gives them a dark color. The concluding part of the operation is to break the mold and to get out the pieces by the passage of the neck, when there remains the complete form of a bottle. In the same way, we may be able to make shoes and boots without seams, if we can add the assistance of earthen molds of the size of the leg or foot to be fitted. We must consider of some means of restoring masses of the caoutchouc to its liquid form, for spreading upon the molds, and if we should not succeed, we must endeavor to draw it in sufficient quantities in its liquid state from the trees themselves. We now began to consider how much farther we would go. The thick bushes of bamboo through which it was impossible to pass seemed to furnish a natural conclusion to our journey. We were therefore unable to ascertain whether or not we should have found a passage beyond the wall of rocks. We perceived then no better resource than to turn to the left towards Cape Disappointment, where the luxurious plantations of sugar canes now again drew our attention. That we might not return empty-handed to Falcon Stream, and might deserve forgiveness for so long an absence, we each took the pains to cut a large bundle of the canes, which we threw across the ass's back, not forgetting the ceremony of reserving one piece to refresh ourselves with along the road. We soon arrived on the well-known shore of the sea, which at length afforded an open and a shorter path. We next reached the wood of Gorge, where we found our sledge loaded as we had left it the night before. We took the sugar canes from the ass and fastened them to the sledge, and then we harnessed the ass, and the patient animal began to draw towards home. And that's the end of chapter 22. Chapter 23, Useful Occupations and Labors, Embellishments, a Painful but Natural Sentiment. On the following day, my wife and the boys importuned me to begin my manufactory of candles. I therefore set myself to recollect all I had read on the subject. I soon perceived that I should be at a loss for a little fat to mix with the wax I had procured from the berries for making the light burn cleaner, but I was compelled to proceed without. I put as many berries into a vessel as it would contain and set it on a moderate fire. My wife, in the meantime, employed herself in making some wicks with the threads of sailcloth. When we saw an oily matter of a pleasing smell and light green color rise to the top of a liquid the berries had yielded, we carefully skimmed it off and put it into a separate vessel, taking care to keep it warm. We continued this process till the berries were exhausted and had produced a considerable quantity of wax. We next dipped the wicks one by one into it while it remained liquid, and then hung them on the bushes to harden. In a short time we dipped them again and repeated the operation till the candles were increased to the proper size, and they were then put in a place and kept till sufficiently hardened for use. We, however, were all eager to judge of our success that very evening by burning one of the candles, with which we were well satisfied. Our success in this last enterprise encouraged us to think of another, the idea of which had long been cherished by our kind steward of provisions. It was to make fresh butter of the cream we every day skimmed from the milk, and which was frequently, to her great vexation, spoiled and given to the animals. The utensil we stood in need of was a churn to turn the cream in. Having earnestly applied my thoughts as to the best manner of conquering the difficulty, I suddenly recollected what I had read in a book of travels of the method used by the Hottentots for making butter. But instead of a sheepskin sewed together at its extremities, I emptied a large gourd, washed it clean, filled it again with cream, and stopped it close with the piece I had cut from the top. I placed my vase of cream on a piece of sailcloth with 4 corners, and tied to each corner a stake. I placed one boy midway between each stake, and directed them to shake the cloth briskly, but with a steady measure for a certain time. This exercise, which seemed like children's play, pleased them mightily, and they called it rocking the cradle. They performed their office, singing and laughing all the time, and in an hour, on taking off the cover, we had the satisfaction of seeing some excellent butter. I had now to propose to my sons a work of a more difficult nature than we had hitherto accomplished. It was the construction of a cart for the conveyance of our effects from place to place, to supersede the sledge, which caused us so much fatigue to load and draw. I tried earnestly and long to accomplish such a machine, but it did not entirely succeed to my wishes, and I wasted in the attempt both time and timber. I, however, produced what from courtesy we called a cart, and it answered the purpose for which it was designed. By this time we had nearly exhausted our stock of clothes, and we were compelled once more to have recourse to the vessel, which we knew still contained some chests fit for our use. To this motive we added an earnest desire to take another look at her, and, if practicable, to bring away a few pieces of cannon. The first fine day I assembled my 3 eldest sons and put my design into execution. We reached the wreck without any striking adventure, and found her still fixed between the rocks, but somewhat more shattered than when we had last seen her. We secured the chests of clothes and whatever remained of ammunition stores, powder, shot, and even such pieces of cannon as we could remove, while those that were too heavy we stripped of their wheels, which might be extremely useful. But to effect our purpose, it was necessary to spend several days in visits to the vessel, returning constantly in the evening, enriched with everything of a portable nature which the wreck contained. Doors, windows, locks, bolts, nothing escaped our grasp, so that the ship was now entirely emptied, with the exception of the large cannon and 3 or 4 immense copper cauldrons. We by degrees contrived to tie the heaviest articles to 2 or 3 empty casks, well pitched, which would thus be sustained above water.
What's a cask?
Cask, it's like a big barrel. It's a big wooden barrel.
Don't forget the baby raccoon.
Yeah. Which would thus be sustained above water. I suppose that the wind and tide would convey the beams and timbers ashore, and thus with little pains we should be possessed of a sufficient quantity of materials for erecting a building at some future time. When these measures were taken, I came to the resolution of blowing up the wreck by a process similar to that which had so well succeeded with the pinnace. We accordingly prepared a cask of gunpowder, which we left on board for the purpose. We rolled it to the place most favorable for our views. We made a small opening in its side, and on quitting the vessel, we inserted a piece of matchwood, which we lighted at the last moment as before. We then sailed with all possible expedition for Safety Bay, where we arrived in a short time. About the time of nightfall, A majestic rolling sound like thunder, accompanied by a column of fire and smoke, announced that the ship so awfully concerned with our peculiar destiny, bless you, which had brought us to our present abode in a desert, and furnished us there with such vast supplies for general comfort, was that instant annihilated, and withdrawn forever from the face of man. At this moment, love for the country that gave us, bless you, us birth, that most powerful sentiment of the human heart, sank with a new force into ours. The ship had disappeared forever. Could we then form a hope ever to behold that country more? We had made a sort of jubilee of witnessing the spectacle. The boys had clapped their hands and skipped about in joyful expectation. But the noise was heard, the smoke and sparks were seen, and the sudden change which took place in our minds could be compared only to the rapidity of these effects of our concerted scheme against the vessel. We all observed a mournful silence, and all rose as it were by an impulse of mutual condemnation, and took the road to Tent House. A night's repose had in some measure relieved the melancholy of the preceding evening, and I went rather early in the morning with the boys to make further observations as to the effects of this remarkable event. We perceived in the water and along the shore abundant vestiges of the departed wreck, and amongst the rest, at a certain distance, the empty casks, cauldrons, and cannon, all tied together and floating in a large mass upon the water. We jumped instantly into the pinnace, and with the tub-boat fastened to it, and made away towards them through the numberless pieces of timber, etc., that intervened, and in a little time reached the object of our search, which from its great weight moved slowly upon the waves. Fritz, with his accustomed readiness, flung some rope round 2 4-pounders and contrived to fasten them to our barge, after which he secured also an enormous quantity of poles, laths, and other useful articles. With this rich booty we returned to land. We performed 3 more trips for the purpose of bringing away more cannon, cauldrons, fragments of masts, etc., all of which we deposited for present convenience in Safety Bay, and now began our most fatiguing operations, the removing such numerous and heavy stores from the boats to the tent house. We separated the cannon and the cauldrons from the tub raft and from each other, and left them in a place which was accessible for the sledge and the beasts of burden. With the help of the crow, we succeeded in getting the cauldrons upon the sledge, and in replacing the 4 wheels we had before taken from the cannon, and now found it easy to make the cow and the ass draw them. The largest of the boilers, or copper cauldrons, we found of the most essential use. We brought out all our barrels of gunpowder and placed them on their ends in 3 separate groups at a short distance from our tent. We dug a little ditch round the hole to draw off the moisture from the ground, and then put one of the cauldrons turned upside down upon each, which completely answered the purpose of an outhouse. The cannon were covered with sailcloth, and upon this we laid heavy branches of trees. The larger casks of gunpowder we prudently removed under a projecting piece of rock, and covered them with planks till we should have leisure for executing the plan of an ammunition storehouse, about which we had all become extremely earnest.
Daddy?
Yes.
Cannon, is that just a cannon? Or
Yeah, that's cannons. That's actual cannon that fire cannonballs.
What does the word afterant mean?
What does the word what?
Afterant mean.
Afterant?
I think she means outhouse.
Outhouse?
Yeah.
Just a house out away from everything else to protect something, in this case.
Oh.
My wife, in taking a survey of these our labors, made the agreeable discovery that 2 of our ducks and 1 of the geese had been brooding under a large bush, and at the time were conducting their little families to the water. The news produced general rejoicings, and the sight of the little creatures so forcibly carried our thoughts to Falcon's Stream that we all conceived the ardent desire of returning to the society of the numerous old friends we had left there. We therefore fixed the next day for our departure and set about the necessary preparations. And that's the end of chapter 23. The next chapter, chapter 24, a new domain, the troop of buffaloes, the vanquished hero.
Don't forget the baby raccoon! If you ever get to see a baby raccoon, do it!
This has been Larry's Library.
Baby raccoons I saw! Oh, darn, coyote! I saw one. It's two.
Bye.
I'll
Find
go.
hidden live video.